The cut was precise, like in the anatomy textbooks I studied in secret. I held his head firmly against the wall as he tried to scream. Blood gushed, but nothing compared to the satisfaction of knowing that poisonous tongue would never utter another word. The insults, the commands, the orders, all silenced forever with a single movement of my pocket knife. The look of terror in his eyes was worth every second of my 17 years of hell. They say violence solves nothing, but whoever says that never had to live with a monster under the same roof. My name is Daniel. I'm 19 now. I spent the last year in a juvenile detention center. I got out 3 months ago. I'm sitting in this empty park because I still haven't gotten used to places full of people. In juvie, I learned to value solitude. You've probably heard about me. The kid who cut off his grandfather's tongue made headlines in the local newspapers. Some called me a psychopath, others a victim who lost control. Nobody really knows what happened during all those years. Nobody except me and that old man, who now can only communicate through pathetic gestures and grunts. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, nor to brag about what I did. I'm here to tell my version, because the story that reached you is just the tip of the iceberg. There are things that were never said, secrets my family preferred to bury, along with the dignity of the poor old man who now needs special care. Before judging the monster I became, I need you to understand the monster he was. Before condemning my hands, I want you to know the words that tongue spoke for years. Because yes, I mutilated my own grandfather, but he mutilated my soul long before that. If you're really paying attention to me, if you care about the truth behind the sensational headlines, I need you to like this video right now, subscribe to Traumatic Accounts, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching this from. You might be the only person who will truly hear my complete story. And believe me, what I'm going to tell will make you question who the real monster in this story is. When I'm finished, you'll understand why a teenager with good grades and no history of violence decided to silence forever the man who should have been his protection and role model. You'll understand why, even after a year of intensive therapy at the detention center, I still don't feel true remorse for what I did. My childhood started like any other kid's. My mother, Elisa, was only 18 when she had me. My father, Ryan, was 20 and worked as a construction helper. We lived in the back house of my paternal grandparents' property, Alfred and Martha. A simple house, but my parents kept it clean and organized with the little they had. The first years were peaceful. I have vague memories of laughter, Sunday barbecues, and my dad teaching me to ride a bike. My grandmother Martha made the best chocolate chip cookies in the neighborhood and let me lick the spoon. My grandfather Alfred was more serious, always with a newspaper in hand, but sometimes he'd smile watching me playing in the yard. Everything changed when I was 6. My dad died in a construction accident. A beam collapsed, and he was underneath. It was instantaneous, they said. As if that was any consolation. My mom, devastated, couldn't work properly anymore. She lost her job at the pharmacy and started doing occasional house cleaning. Money got tight, very tight, and that's when my grandfather Alfred showed his first claws. "You're going to have to contribute more around here," he said one day during dinner. "I can't support freeloaders." My mother cried silently. My grandmother tried to calm him down, but he silenced her with a look. I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I felt the weight of humiliation on my mother's shoulders. Gradually, Alfred began to exercise more control over our lives. My mother needed permission to go out. She had to show how much she earned from each cleaning job. She had to listen to comments about how she wasn't good enough, how my father had been weak and careless, how I was a useless expense. "This boy won't amount to anything, just like his father." That's what he would say frequently in front of me, as if I were invisible. By age 7, I was already trying to be as quiet as possible when he was home. Any noise was reason for complaints and insults. When I turned 8, my grandmother Martha was diagnosed with cancer. The treatments consumed all the family's savings. She passed away 6 months later. That's when Alfred completely lost control. The house, already tense, became a minefield. My grandfather blamed the world for his loss. He blamed my mother for draining money that could have saved my grandmother. Blamed me for existing. Everything was a reason to explode. "You two are the cockroaches that killed my Martha," he would sometimes say, mixing in Spanish words he learned in his youth. He called us cockroaches that killed his Martha. My mother started going out more to work, or at least that's what she said. Today, I understand it was also an escape. She couldn't take the insults, the humiliation anymore, and I was left alone with him. By age 10, I was already the main target of my grandfather's frustrations. At school, I was quiet and studious. The teachers even praised me. At home, it was different. Any grade below excellent was reason to be called stupid, useless, a waste of oxygen. One day I'll throw you out on the street like the dog you are. He constantly threatened. I tried to tell my mom what happened when she wasn't around. She listened, cried, promised she would find a place just for us, but the money was never enough, and months turned into years. When I was 12, my mom met Victor. He seemed nice, had a steady job as a security guard, and promised to get us out of that situation. For a few months I had hope. Victor would come to visit, bring small gifts, and my grandfather even behaved better in his presence. We even visited an apartment to rent, small, but it would be just ours. I remember falling asleep smiling that night, imagining a life without my grandfather's daily insults. A week before the planned move, Victor disappeared, vanished with my mother's savings. She fell into deep depression, stopped working for a few weeks. We became even more dependent on my grandfather. I told you he just wanted to screw you, you idiot, my grandfather repeated daily. No man is going to want an old sow with a parasite son. It was around this time that I started having trouble sleeping, constant nightmares. At school, my performance dropped. I received my first warning for fighting with a classmate who made a joke about my mother. At home, this earned me an especially cruel session of humiliation. You can't even fight right. You got beat up like a little girl. Your father must be turning in his grave with shame. At 14, I tried to seek help. I talked to the school counselor, told her about the psychological abuse. She called my mother and grandfather in for a conversation. It was a disaster. My grandfather, always manipulative, played the victim. He cried, talked about how difficult it was raising a rebellious teenager after losing his wife. The counselor suggested family therapy, which never happened. At home, the hell got worse. Traitor piece of shit, after all I do for you, you're going to report me to others. Want to see me in jail? I'm the only family you've got, ungrateful. That same year, my mother started drinking. I don't blame her. It was her way to escape. But it meant I was even more alone. Sometimes she wouldn't come home for days. My grandfather would say she was selling herself like a whore. I pretended not to hear, but each word was a knife. The isolation kept growing. I lost the few friends I had. At school, I became a ghost, present only physically. At home, I developed techniques to avoid encounters with my grandfather. I learned his schedules, his habits. I knew when to stay in my room, when it was safe to use the bathroom, when I could eat. But no matter how much I tried to be invisible, he always found ways to reach me. The house was too small to hide my existence. When I turned 15, my grandfather Alfred began having health problems, high blood pressure, diabetes. The doctors recommended a strict diet and medications. This only worsened his temperament. Physical frailty seemed to increase his need to exercise psychological power. Come here, useless. I need you to get my medicine. It was always an order, never a request. And always followed by comments about how I was a burden, how he had to spend money on medication because of me, how the stress of putting up with me was slowly killing him. It was around this time that I discovered his diary, an old notebook where he not only recorded expenses and appointments, but also thoughts. I found it accidentally while looking for a document he had sent me to find. Hidden under his mattress was this worn notebook with pages yellowed by time. Curiosity was stronger. I began reading it secretly whenever I had the opportunity. It was like opening the door to hell. In those pages I met the real Alfred, the man behind the mask of the sacrificed grandfather. The boy looks at me today with the same eyes as his father, eyes of weakness, of a parasite. In other passages, he fantasized about my mother having an accident. There were detailed plans to evict us from the house as soon as I turned 16, comments about how he had been too generous in allowing us to stay after my father's death. But the worst were the revelations about my father. According to those pages, my grandfather always despised him, called him a sissy, weak, incapable. And most shockingly, there were insinuations that the accident that killed my father hadn't been so accidental. The idiot was in the right place at the right time. Sometimes fate conspires in our favor. There was no explicit confession, But the subtext suggested my grandfather knew about some problem at the construction site, knew about the danger, and didn't warn my father. Maybe he even contributed to the accident. The discovery destroyed me inside. For weeks I read and reread those pages, trying to find concrete proof, something I could take to the police, but it was all too vague. It could just be the delusions of a bitter old man. I began to observe him with different eyes. Each gesture, each word, each look had a darker meaning now. The anger grew inside me, silent but increasingly stronger. At 16, I had a direct confrontation with him for the first time. My mother was on one of her disappearances, probably drinking in some bar. He started with the usual insults during dinner. "This food is crap, just like everything you do." Normally, I would lower my head and continue eating in silence. But something broke inside me that day. "At least I do something. You just complain." The silence that followed was terrifying. He looked at me as if seeing a stranger. Then, with a frightening calmness, he got up from the table, walked over to me, and slapped me across the face. It wasn't a normal slap. It was calculated to hurt, to humiliate. "You are nothing, never were, never will be. Your father was a worm and you're worse. I'm disgusted to share my blood with you." The words hurt more than the slap. Something changed at that moment. The barrier of fear that contained me began to crumble. I didn't respond, but I didn't lower my eyes either. I held his gaze until he moved away, muttering about my ingratitude. In the following months, confrontations became more frequent. He intensified the insults, the humiliations, as if testing my limits. I could no longer completely keep quiet. I would respond, albeit briefly. Each of my responses was followed by more serious threats. "I'll make you sleep with the stray dogs. You won't turn 18 under this roof. I should have drowned you when you were born, like they do with unwanted puppies." My mother, when she was present and sober enough to notice the tension, tried to intervene, but her voice no longer had strength. Years of abuse had broken any resistance in her. Sometimes it seemed she was afraid of me, of what I might do. One night, when I was almost 17, I found her crying in the small bedroom we shared. "What happened?" I asked, fearing the answer. She raised her tear-swollen face and showed a bruise on her arm. "Your grandfather, he said I stole money from him. I swear I didn't take anything, Daniel." Something snapped inside me. The physical violence, which before was directed only at me in extreme occasions, now reached my mother too. The old man was completely losing control. "Let's get out of here," I said, holding her hands. "It doesn't matter where. Any place is better than this house." She nodded, crying more. We promised each other that we would save money, that in a few weeks we would have enough to rent a room, anything. It was an empty promise, and part of me knew it. But we needed to believe in something. 2 nights later, my mother didn't come home. One day passed, then another. On the 3rd day, I received the news. She had been found dead in an alley, apparently the victim of a mugging followed by a beating. I broke completely. The only person who loved me, who tried to protect me, even in her fragility, had been taken from me. And when I returned from identifying the body at the morgue, still in shock, the first thing I heard from my grandfather was, "I told you she would end up like this. Drunk whore. At least now I won't have to support 2 parasites." At that moment, something inside me died. The little humanity I still struggled to preserve was extinguished like a candle in the wind. I entered a state of emotional numbness. I stopped going to school. I spent hours lying down, looking at the ceiling, planning, because now I had a plan. It wasn't about surviving or escaping anymore. It was about justice, about silencing forever that poisonous tongue that had destroyed 3 generations of our family. For weeks, I observed his every move, his schedules, his habits, his weaknesses. He was already 72, more physically fragile, but his tongue remained as sharp as ever. He continued to torment me daily, now with new insults about my dead mother. "Your mother was a slut who didn't even know who your real father was. She begged to die, you know? Nobody can stand living being so useless. You have an expiration date in this house, kid. I'm counting the days." Each word was recorded, stored, feeding my plan. I no longer felt anger. It was something colder, more calculated. I began studying anatomy at the public library. I focused especially on the head and neck region. I wanted to understand exactly how the human tongue works, how it connects, how it can be removed. I got a job at a butcher shop. The owner, Mr. Matthews, was a quiet man who didn't ask many questions. He just taught me how to cut meat with precision. I learned fast. My hands seemed to have a natural talent for working with knives. The plan was taking shape, becoming more detailed, more viable each day. I bought a pocket knife with money from the butcher shop, small, sharp, discreet. I started carrying it with me always, feeling its weight in my pocket like a silent promise. The date was approaching. I decided it would be the day I turned 17 and a half, an arbitrary milestone but significant to me. It would be my present to myself, freedom, justice, silence. The day began like any other. I woke up early, before him, prepared coffee, tidied the kitchen. Alfred got up in a bad mood, as always. Complained about weak coffee, old bread, poorly washed dishes. This coffee tastes like cat piss. You can't even do this right. I just listened as I had for years, but inside I was counting the hours. I knew he would leave to play dominoes with his friends at the corner bar at 2 p.m., return at 5 p.m., take his medication, and then watch the news on the old TV in the living room. I went to the butcher shop. Worked normally. Mr. Matthews commented that I seemed different. Lighter, he said. I just smiled. He didn't know that would be my last day of work. I left early, claiming a headache. I stopped at the pharmacy and bought some sleeping pills. I returned home before my grandfather. Prepared his blood pressure medicine, adding 2 crushed sleeping pills to the glass of water I always left beside his medicine. At 5:10 p.m. he arrived, grumbling about the heat, about how all his friends were getting senile, about how the neighborhood was full of unemployed bums. He complained that I hadn't made dinner yet. What do I keep you in this house for? You can't even cook. I replied that I would make pasta. He grunted in disapproval but went to the living room and turned on the TV. He took his medicine with the water I had prepared. I smiled internally, watching him empty the glass. The pills began to take effect during the news. I noticed his eyes getting heavy, his head nodding to the side. He fought against sleep, muttering about being too tired for an old man his age. I'm going to lie down for a bit. Wake me when dinner is ready. I nodded, watching him walk with uncertain steps to the bedroom. I waited 20 minutes, enough time for the pills to take full effect. I entered the bedroom silently. He was lying on his back, snoring lightly. It was time. I felt a surreal calm take over my body. There was no hesitation, no fear, just the certainty that I was doing what needed to be done. I took the pocket knife out of my pocket. The blade reflected the little light coming through the window. I approached the bed, observing for a moment the face of the man who had destroyed my life, my mother's life, and possibly contributed to my father's death. He wasn't my grandfather anymore, just a cruel old man who needed to be silenced. With a quick movement, I pressed my forearm against his throat, waking him in the process. His eyes opened, disoriented by the medication, but soon widened in recognition and terror upon seeing the knife in my hand. What are you? He tried to speak, but my pressure on his throat made breathing difficult. It's time for you to shut up, old man. Forever. He tried to fight, but the pills and age made him too weak. I pressed his head against the wall, forcing his mouth open. With my free hand, I grabbed his tongue and pulled it out as far as I could. The terror in his eyes was indescribable. He realized at that moment what was about to happen. This tongue destroyed 3 lives. It won't destroy any more. With precision, as I had learned at the butcher shop, I made a deep cut at the base of the tongue. The blood gushed immediately, more than I had expected. He tried to scream, but the sound that came out was a grotesque gargle. I continued cutting, feeling the resistance of the muscle yield to the sharp blade. When I finished, I threw the piece of flesh on the floor. He was thrashing, trying to contain the bleeding with his hands, making inhuman sounds. I just watched, feeling a bizarre mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Now you know what it's like to be silenced. I left him there, bleeding and grunting. I went to the bathroom, washed the knife and my bloodied hands. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the young man staring back. There was a coldness in my eyes I had never seen before. I returned to the bedroom. The old man was conscious, but in shock. The bleeding had decreased a bit. I picked up the phone and dialed emergency services. I need an ambulance, my grandfather. He had an accident. When the ambulance arrived, I told a story about how he had fallen out of bed during a nightmare, hit his mouth, and bit his own tongue. The paramedics seemed suspicious, but the priority was to stabilize him and take him to the hospital. I accompanied the ambulance. At the hospital, I repeated the same story. The doctors had their doubts. Such a clean and deep cut would hardly be caused by a fall. But there was no concrete evidence against my version. Or at least that's what I thought. 3 days later, when he was stable, the police showed up at the hospital. A nurse had found a note he had written. Grandson cut tongue. Daniel, it was enough to take me to the police station. During the interrogation, I maintained my story for a few hours, but eventually something inside me gave way. Maybe it was fatigue, or maybe I wanted the world to know what that man had done. I confessed. I told everything. The years of psychological abuse, the threats, the humiliations. I talked about the diary, about the insinuations related to my father's death, about how he treated my mother, about how he reacted when she died. The detective listened in silence. When I finished, he sighed deeply. Son, you've committed a serious crime. You'll have to answer for it. I nodded. I already expected that. But he continued. We'll consider all the circumstances. Your age, your clean record, the family context. I can't promise anything, but I'll recommend that you be sent to a juvenile rehabilitation center, not a regular prison. That's what happened. The trial was quick, considering the confession. My grandfather, unable to speak, just looked at me with hatred from the wheelchair where he sat. The doctors explained that he would never be able to speak normally again. The damage was irreversible. I was sentenced to a year in the Juvenile Rehabilitation Center with mandatory therapy and psychological counseling. It could have been much worse. The judge considered all the mitigating circumstances. When I left the courtroom, still handcuffed, I passed by my grandfather. He tried to make some sound, some insult perhaps, but only managed to produce a pathetic grunt. Our eyes met one last time. Goodbye, old man, I said. I hope the silence teaches you something. The rehabilitation center wasn't as bad as I expected. It had structure, clear rules, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to walk on eggshells, afraid of provoking someone's anger. The therapy sessions were difficult at first. I had never spoken openly about everything I went through, but gradually I began to process the trauma. During that year, I learned a lot about myself, about how abuse can shape a person, transform them into something they never imagined becoming. I met other young people with equally traumatic stories, each dealing with their demons in their own way. Dr. Mendez, my psychologist at the center, was the first positive father figure I had. He never judged me, even on days when I stated I felt no remorse for what I did. Remorse will come when you're ready, he would say. First, you need to process the anger. And there was a lot of anger. Anger at my grandfather, at the life that was imposed on me, at the system that failed to protect me when I sought help. Anger at my mother for not being strong enough to get us out of that situation. Anger at myself for having become an aggressor. Gradually, with therapy and time, anger began to give way to other emotions. Sadness for what could have been, grief for the childhood I never had, understanding that we were all products of circumstances beyond our control. My grandfather, I learned through social workers, went to a nursing home after being discharged from the hospital. He could no longer live alone. The house where I grew up was sold to pay for medical expenses. It's ironic to think that I ended up homeless anyway, but in a much healthier environment than that house of horrors. I received some letters during my internment. Concerned neighbors, a teacher who always suspected something was wrong, even Mr. Matthews from the butcher shop, all expressing surprise, sadness, and, in some cases, a silent understanding of what led me to that point. I didn't receive any letter from my grandfather, of course. Even if he wanted to write, I doubt he would have anything to say to me besides hatred. When I left the rehabilitation center 3 months ago, I was a different young man. Not completely healed, I doubt I ever will be, but more aware of my traumas and how they affected me. Now I live in a support home for vulnerable youth. I finished high school during my internment and got a job at a print shop. It's not much, but it's a fresh start. One day at a time, as Dr. Mendez always said. People treat me differently when they discover who I am. The boy who cut off his grandfather's tongue. Some stay away out of fear. Others are too curious. Wanting sordid details I refuse to share. Few are really interested in knowing the person beyond the act. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. I dream about that room, about the blood, about the look of panic in my grandfather's eyes. In some dreams I regret it and try to stop the bleeding. In others, I cut deeper, completing the job I started. I don't know which version scares me more. In the therapy I continue doing, we discuss a lot about forgiveness. Not forgiving my grandfather. I'm not ready for that and maybe never will be. But forgiving myself for having become, even if briefly, the monster I so feared. Dr. Mendez says my case is a classic example of the cycle of violence. Victims who become aggressors. The difference, according to him, is that I interrupted the cycle before it became a pattern. A single act of extreme violence instead of years of continuous abuse, as my grandfather practiced. Does that make me better than him? I don't know. The line between victim and aggressor is thinner than we like to admit. Last week I visited the nursing home where my grandfather is. I didn't go in. I just observed the building from across the street, imagining him in there, unable to torment anyone else with that poisonous tongue. A nurse who was leaving the place recognized me somehow, maybe from the news, maybe from having read my case. He has no one else, she told me hesitantly. The other elderly avoid him. The staff does only what's necessary. I felt a pang of something. Not exactly pity, perhaps an understanding of the isolation he created for himself over decades, pushing away everyone around him. Can he still communicate? I asked. He uses a notebook, writes little, mainly complaints. I nodded. Some things never change. He asks about you sometimes, she added, surprising me. Wants to know where you are, what you're doing. I didn't respond. What could I say? That part of me still wishes he suffers alone? That another part feels a strange responsibility? A distorted bond that not even a knife cut could completely break? Now, sitting in this empty park, reviewing my entire story, I wonder if I'll ever find definitive answers. If I'll ever fully understand what led me to that room, that moment, that decision. Does violence solve anything? For my grandfather, it solved years of frustration and bitterness. He took out on us what he couldn't resolve within himself. For me, it silenced a source of torment, but created other voices in my mind that will probably accompany me for the rest of my life. Some will say I'm a monster, that I should have sought other solutions, others that I'm a victim who reacted in the only way I knew. The truth is probably somewhere between these two views. What I know for sure is that no one should go through what I went through. No child should grow up in fear inside their own home. No teenager should feel that the only way out is the violent silencing of their abuser. The system failed me at various points. The school that saw the signs but didn't act strongly enough. The neighbors who heard the screams but preferred not to get involved. The social workers too overloaded to give proper attention to yet another case of possible abuse. I'm not here to apologize for what I did, nor to justify it, just to tell my story, so that perhaps someone in a similar situation will find help before reaching the point of no return, as I did. If you've made it this far and understood what I went through, I need you to like this video now, subscribe to Traumatic Accounts, hit the notification bell, and comment what time it is where you are as you watch this. It may seem like a strange request, but knowing that real people are listening to my story at this specific moment in time gives me a sense of connection I rarely felt in life. I don't know what the future holds for me. I have plans to go back to studying, maybe get a psychology degree. I want to better understand what happens in the human mind, what leads people like my grandfather to become monsters, and people like me to eventually follow the same path. Meanwhile, I live one day at a time. I learned to deal with the nightmares, with the looks, with the inappropriate questions. I learned to recognize the signs of anger growing inside me and to channel it in non-destructive ways, as Dr. Mendez taught me. My tongue is intact, as are my memories. And that's why I tell this story, so that it isn't silenced, like so many other stories of abuse are, so that other tongues can speak the truth before desperation leads them to irreversible acts. This is my story. Not beautiful, not heroic, but true. What would you do in my place? Don't answer too quickly. Think, really think, because no one knows what they're capable of until they're pushed beyond their limits. I am Daniel. I'm 19, and I silenced forever the tongue that poisoned my existence. I'm not proud of it. I don't totally regret it. I just live with the consequences, day after day, as I learn to use my own voice for something beyond pain.